Are you getting excited to head out to the lake, pond, stream, or river to start chasing spring trout? What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another trout fishing tips video here at Herman's Outdoors. Today, we're going through the top 5 spring trout fishing tips. Springtime is one of my favorite times of the year. The weather starts to get a little warmer, the days get a little longer with more sunshine, and the trout fishing really starts to pick up. And my wife complains that she never sees me on the weekend. The spring season means lakes and ponds start to get stocked with trout. Those days of yelling fish on a dozen or more times is right around the corner, and the 4 a.m. wake up calls to get to the secret fishing spots. As the weather and water changes, places get stocked with trout, and the days get longer, it's time to gear up and get fishing. So before you head out for some spring trout fishing, incorporate these spring trout fishing tips. Number 5, talk to the locals. This is a tip my grandfather shared when I was just a kid and really getting into trout fishing. Wherever he went trout fishing in the spring, whether it was the first time fishing a body of water or a place he had fished dozens of times, he would always find the local bait shop or shack, buy some night crawlers and fresh bait, and ask how the fishing was. And for anyone heading out for some spring trout fishing, especially if you haven't fished since the fall, stop at the local bait shop first. I found that the local bait shops always know how the fishing is going, when places have been recently stocked and on what days, what kinds of bait people are buying, and what might be the hot color or style, and where on the water people are catching trout. So at your local bait shop, become friends with the people who work there. Ask them what baits are working, where people are catching the most trout. You'll be surprised how much information people will share. So go talk to the locals at the bait shop near where you fish before you hit the water. And just remember to grab the bait you bought and your apple fritter after paying for it. Don't ask me how I know. Number 4, throw out old bait. For many years as a kid, I would see my dad keep jars of trout eggs and power baits that were dozens of years old. And looking back on it, those baits hardly ever caught any trout, especially the trout eggs he had for years and years. One of my tips for keeping my baits as fresh as possible is to keep the power baits at room temperature and the eggs at room temp or in the fridge, but never in the garage or a location where the temperature fluctuates. And over the last handful of years, I've utilized these tips to keep my baits longer and fresher. However, I have found that trout eggs and other baits do have a shelf life and a point when they go bad. So it's time to throw them out. I've even thrown out a half jar of eggs from the prior fall after I couldn't catch anything with them on a stocked lake where I always catch trout. If you're using old bait at a place that's recently stocked, or you know you can get bites and it's not happening, buy new bait. Throw out the old stuff. I've had very little success with old bait over the years. And yes, I have seen some people catch trout with 20-year-old power bait, but it's so rare with old bait to constantly and consistently catch trout. So if you have any doubts about the bait, chuck it and buy new baits. So before you head out this spring, consider throwing out some of those older baits, especially if you aren't catching anything. Number 3, deploy high water tactics. Snow melting in the mountains and spring runoffs play a huge factor in the water conditions for spring trout fishing. Where I fish here in my home state of Oregon, our spring rains can rise small creeks, rivers, ponds, and lakes inches, even feet in a matter of hours. So pay attention to the water levels when you encounter high water. Use high water tactics to catch trout. Find slower moving water pockets, structure and shade when the sun is out, and waters that are warming up. Find cleaner water and avoid dirty water to find fish in slow currents and seams. Trout fishing when waters are high can be tough. You will have to put in additional time to find trout, and paying very close attention to how the water looks, how the water is moving and at what speed, and how structure and landscapes are playing into where the fish can be is the difference between a day of sightseeing all day and catching some spring trout. Number 2, watch the weather. The springtime brings plenty of trout fishing opportunities, whether it's holdover fish from the fall and the winter or newly planted stock trout. And one important detail to watch when chasing trout is the weather. Always plan ahead and look at the day's forecast before heading out to the water. Seeing what the weather will be tomorrow could help narrow down colors to use depending on if it's cloudy or sunny, getting out of the wind if it's a really windy day. A rainy day could make the watercolor change and push the fish into very small clear water pockets, or increases in outside and water temperature could change where the fish are hanging out and when the bite starts. Before I head out, I always check the weather and the wind forecast. I also check my fishing journal for similar conditions the prior spring, narrow down my bait and color choices to what I've fished before in water conditions that are the same, and use apps like onX Maps to pin spots where I want to fish if it's a new fishing location. Do some homework, watch the weather, and adjust your plans accordingly when you hit the water. A good trout fisherman always makes tweaks and pivots according to the weather, like quitting when the wind's blowing 40 miles an hour. Don't ask me how I know. And number 1, kiss, or keep it simple, stupid. When I break down my successes for catching spring trout, I stay with the basics and keep it simple. From using the same power bait colors as the prior spring, making slight leader length adjustments, fishing the same spots I have had epic trout fishing days, to using the same scents on my baits. What has worked before can work again, so don't make huge and drastic changes. In my fishing journal I keep from every trout fishing trip out, I document the colors and baits I use every single time. And in the last handful of spring trout fishing seasons, I always find I'm using the same colors, the same baits, the same locations, and making small adjustments based off of water conditions, weather, and seeing what might be working for others. Spring trout fishing is not complex, especially in recently stocked waters. You may need to make small leader adjustments, but go with what has worked in prior springs. Don't overthink it, don't try to do too much, and don't try to change too many things. Stick to what works because it will pay off with memorable trout fishing adventures. And that's my top 5 spring trout fishing tips. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, hit that like button. Comment below on your favorite spring trout fishing tip, and if you like trout fishing, and other outdoor content, hit that subscribe button below. Now get out there and catch some spring trout. Just don't kiss the trout. Don't ask me how I know.